My name is John Murphy, and I'm a member of the Council, and I am an inspector with the Department of Education. I am the second voice from Cork today, following Patsy. And I was wondering, when she spoke about the principal asking if that shower is outside, was she at all tempted to walk into the principal and say, "I know you're a busy man, and I don't wish to rain on your parade." But she was too kind for that. It is my pleasure to act as chair for session 2. The title is Experiences and Outcomes for Children with Special Educational Needs in Ireland. We have 3 speakers in our first session within that, and we have Dr. Jude Cosgrove, Caroline McKeown, and Dr. Joseph Travers. I know time is of the essence, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the biographies, but I just want to introduce the 3 speakers while everyone is settling in a very, very short way. Jude Cosgrove has worked as a research associate at the Educational Research Centre Dublin since 1997. She has been involved in various studies over the years, including the Programme for International Student Assessment, the International Civic and Citizenship Education Study, national assessments of reading and mathematics at primary level, and a study of early school leaving on behalf of the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Education and Skills. She is principal investigator of a team from the Educational Research Centre and St Patrick's College, Drumcondra, on the NCSE's study on outcomes of children with special educational needs. Caroline McKeown has been working as a research assistant in the Educational Research Centre Dublin since November 2012. She is currently involved in the national implementation of the OECD's Programme for International Student Assessment, which assesses the skills and knowledge of 15-year-olds in science, reading and mathematics. And Dr. Joe Travers is a senior lecturer and director of Special Education Department in St Patrick's. He is a graduate of Colostre Mhuire Marino, Trinity College, St Patrick's College, Drumcondra, in UI Maynooth and Queen's University, Belfast. He has published in the areas of policy and practice in special education and learning support for mathematics, inclusive education, leadership and early interventions. The title of the presentation and research will be Educational Experiences and Outcomes for Children with Special Educational Needs, a secondary analysis of data from the Growing Up in Ireland study. Thank you, Jude.
Good afternoon. I hope everybody can hear me. I have my stopwatch on my phone, by the way, so I'm going to keep my eye on the time, I think. It's very hard when you're excited about the results of a study to stick to time, but we're going to do our best. So I think the 3 of us were very honoured to be here and very glad to see so many people here as well. I'm just going to go straight into the presentation because, as I said, time is of the essence. I suppose this first slide shows you, I suppose we can say simplistically, there's been a lot of investment into special educational needs, but on the other hand, not a whole lot is known about how these children are doing. That's a little bit simplistic maybe, but the NCSE, or National Council for Special Education, issued a call for tender last January to look at this issue, and a team consisting of colleagues at the Educational Research Centre and St Patrick's College Drumcondra have worked on this study, and the report for the study has been put on the NCS website today, and we're really grateful, I think, to Claire Farrell, who's been particularly supportive right the way through this study, and also to Jennifer Dorn. There are many other people to thank, but I particularly want to thank those 2 people. This presentation is really a very quick walkthrough of the key findings of the report. So it runs the risk in a way of being a bit of a mile wide, inch deep look at findings, but I think we want to give you a flavour of the range of results in the report. So we're going to do like a relay presentation. I'll talk you through some of the introductory things like the classification of children and some of the quantitative findings. I'll then hand you over to Caroline McKeown, who's going to talk you through qualitative findings, and she's going to hand over to Joe Travers, who's going to talk us through the conclusions and recommendations. I want to acknowledge the full research team. A couple of people, there's 6 people altogether on the team, myself, Caroline, and the Director of the Educational Research Centre, Peter Archer, along with Joe Travers and his colleagues Zita Lysat and Orla Neve-Rinn. Thanks to everybody involved. The background, 2 main aims here of this study. Using the Growing Up in Ireland 9-year-old cohort, the aims are to, first of all, help us to understand more clearly how children with special needs and subgroups of these children are doing in relation to 5 sets of key outcomes, and you can see them there. We have achievement, participation, progress, independence, well-being. Our second aim is to identify and analyse the factors associated with these outcomes. So these could be children's background, home environments, for example, and to identify potential implications for educational policy practice. And I'll explain in a moment why we have not examined progress in the present study. Some of you may be familiar with the Growing Up in Ireland study, but in case you're not, a brief overview here. It's a large-scale, very significant longitudinal study of children under the auspices of the Office of the Minister for Children. It's part of our National Children's Strategy. It has 2 age cohorts as its focus, an infant cohort and a child cohort. And both cohorts have been examined or surveyed, if you like, on 2 occasions. The first survey, the first occasion is called Wave 1, and the second occasion is called Wave 2. So the focus of this report or this presentation is on Wave 1 of the child cohort. So that was when children were aged 9. These children completed questionnaires. They also completed short tests of reading and maths. Their parents completed questionnaires, so did their school principals and their teachers, and a subset of these families also took part in interviews. So there's a huge amount of information collected from these children. So I'm going to just tell you now what I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you what I told you I'd tell you. I'll first look at the classification scheme, because really it's the classification of these children that underpins the results, if you know what I mean. These are the groups that we're focusing on. I'll just describe the kinds of outcomes that we examined, bearing in mind again that this is not an in-depth look at the report at all. It really is just a small selection of the key results. I'll go through some of the key quantitative results. Caroline will talk through the qualitative results from the interviews with parents and children, and Joe Travers will talk us through the recommendations. Okay, so initially we identified 8 groups of children with special needs, and you can see the list up there. I won't read through it. There are a couple of limitations, in fact maybe more than a couple of limitations with this classification system, which relate to the fact that the Growing Up in Ireland study was not explicitly designed to provide an in-depth examination of special needs. It does, however, contain a lot of information on special needs. So we have, I'll just make one comment about the groups there. I hope you can read them, or you can see them in the handout there. The social, emotional, behavioural disability or difficulty, or SEBD, we have 2 groups of children here. We have medium risk and high risk. They're not the same as the groups that have been identified by, or that's not the same classification that the Department of Education and Skills uses. This identification is based on teachers' and parents' reports on a questionnaire called the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, which has very good clinical validity, but it's not the same as what the department uses. So I think it's quite important to make that point. I think the key point on this slide is that we have these 8 groups, but when we look across the 8 groups, we can see that there are 30% of children who belong in more than one group. So as has been referred to quite frequently this morning, there's many children with quite complex needs. So in order to capture the more common combinations of special needs, we came up with this 12-group classification. And as you can see, I won't read out the categories to you, but as you can see, SEBD combines frequently with other conditions. So, for example, we might have dyslexia, one group, and then dyslexia with SEBD. The overall prevalence rate that you can see here is about 28%, which is higher than some other estimates in the literature perhaps, but it's a very similar estimate to that provided previously by Joanne Banks and Selena McCoy, also using this data. They estimated 25%, so it's fairly consistent with that. This is just a distribution of boys and girls across the scheme, and again, very consistent with the literature. We have overall maybe 60% boys, 40% girls identified as having special educational needs, but there's a lot of variation across the groups. So for example, we've many more boys with autistic spectrum disorder, but we have maybe, in contrast, equal percentages of boys and girls in our medium risk SEBD category. So there's a lot of variation there. Some limitations of the study, very briefly. Even though the GUI, or Growing Up in Ireland study, is longitudinal, we're looking at wave 1, so we only have one data point, so we can't unfortunately examine progress over time. However, we're just beginning work, I'm glad to say, on the wave 2 data, so we will be able to pick up on this theme and examine how these children have progressed over time at the second wave, when they would have been 13 years old and most, if not all, in post-primary school settings. So that's quite interesting and exciting. Again, there are some limitations to the classification scheme. For example, the general learning difficulty or disability classification, we were not able to distinguish between children with mild, moderate and severe general learning difficulties, unfortunately. So that group is all treated as a single group. Also, as I mentioned earlier, the SEBD groups are not consistent with what the department uses. We have in the data very little information on the supports for these children, so it's not a focus of the findings really. Fourthly, the sample design of the GUI, it's designed to give us an idea of what children, the population of children age 9 in this case in Ireland, how they are, how they're getting on. It's not designed to give us an idea of how the population of schools in Ireland is. So any conclusions that we might make about school level characteristics and their associations with outcomes, for example, they're not as robust as they would be for individual children, because the sample wasn't designed explicitly to provide school level population estimates. Fifthly, there's no direct link between the qualitative and quantitative data sets, and this was done to protect the anonymity of the participants. So if we find something very interesting in one of the interviews, for example, we can't triangulate it back with the case in the quantitative data set because there's no link. So obviously, to protect anonymity, that needs to be done, but we are a little bit limited in how we triangulate findings here. And finally, it's important to note that the numbers of children in some of the special needs groups are quite small. I think, for example, the number of children in the ASD or autistic spectrum group are maybe 70. So they are quite small in some cases. I'm going to look now at outcomes. Actually, before I look at outcomes, again, this is really, I feel like we're going to just be bombarding data at you, and I don't want people to feel like that. I think it might be useful to bear two things in mind as you look through the next few slides. The first thing is, even though some of the findings aren't maybe surprising to many of you, they do nonetheless provide hard empirical data, which arguably we've been lacking. So one of the things that really jumped out at us when we started looking at these findings is the big variation among the 12 groups on the outcomes. There's a huge variation. So to talk about children with special needs is to talk about a really, really heterogeneous group with really mixed and complex needs. The second key thing that really jumped out at us when we looked at these findings is the evidence of an additive impact of social, emotional and behavioural difficulties when combined with another special need. So there may be two things to keep in mind as you look through the results with me here. This is an example of an achievement outcome. These are the mean reading and maths scores of children. On the left-hand side of the slide there, you can see the mean scores of children without special educational needs and with special educational needs. And the difference overall when we combine the 12 groups is about 2/3 of a standard deviation. But the remainder of the graph there shows you the means on reading and maths. Reading is the dark red bar. Shows again there's huge variation across the groups, and in fact there's no difference in the reading and maths scores of the children with the physical or sensory disability to those without any special need. So that's a very positive finding. There's also an interesting finding with regard to children with autistic spectrum disorder. Their scores aren't significantly different to children without special needs either, but there are other groups with quite low scores. I'm going to just skip in a couple of slides here because I want to be mindful of the time. We also looked at children's achievement or attainment from the point of view of teachers. How do teachers perceive children doing? And we cross-tabulated the teachers' ratings of the children with the children's actual test scores. I think this slide alone we could debate about this for an hour maybe, but it's basically, if you look at the green numbers there, you can see that it seems that children with a special need are being underestimated in terms of their test scores. If we use the test score as a second measure of proficiency, they're being underestimated more frequently than children without special needs. And conversely, children without special needs are being overestimated about twice as often as children with special needs. So there's something going on there. And it would be tempting to delve into the results at some stage and say, both sources of information are valid, obviously. What's going on there? Is there a local class norm in operation? What is going on there? So it's a kind of provocative slide, but I think it's an interesting finding. This is another outcome that we looked at, parental educational expectations for their children. Now, of course, children were only 9 years old at this time, but parents still had a fair idea of how far in the education system they hoped their children would attain. And we see there's a difference between overall, if we look again at the left-hand side of the graph, children without special needs, about 78% of the parents of those children expect them to go to university, compared with 53% of children with special needs. And again, we can see quite a large variation across the 12 groups. The educational expectations of children with a physical or sensory disability are quite high. You can see that's the third bar from the right-hand side. And then children with a general learning difficulty and combined with SEBD of parents with quite low educational expectations on this measure. So that's something that we're particularly keen to follow up in the Wave 2 data. This is another outcome. This is a very broad indicator of children's engagement. So it's a measure of children's liking of school and school subjects. And even this is a little bit concerning because if you look at the top of the graph there, you can see that children with special needs, even at age 9, are more frequently expressing a dislike of school. And again, taking the theme of variation across groups, there's huge variation. Children with general learning difficulties and with speech and language disorders with SEBD quite like school, but children with dyslexia and SEBD were most likely to say they didn't enjoy school. So that's a little bit of a worry because if you look at the literature on early school leaving and disengagement, it tends to be a one-way street. So once we see this happening at age 9, it is a bit of a concern. This is a measure of children's well-being. These are questions that the children answered themselves about how they felt in general. So it's self-report well-being measure. Overall, it has a mean of 50 and a standard deviation of 10. And we can see that children, again, as a bigger group at the top of the table there, have a mean score on the Piers-Harris Wellbeing Scale that's about half a standard deviation lower than their peers without special needs. That's quite a big difference. And then if we look further into the 12 groups, I've highlighted a couple of numbers there in green. We can see that some groups have quite low scores on this measure, and they tend to feature SEBD. So there's something there worth thinking about as well, I think. I'm going to talk just very quickly through examples of some of the children's background characteristics that we examined. This graph shows you the mean socioeconomic index or occupation scores of parents, and also the percentage of social welfare, the percentage of the household income coming from social welfare. So we could say that's maybe social welfare dependence. And you can see again, if you look at the left-hand side of the graph, you can see that there isn't really much of a difference in terms of the occupational scores of parents, or even across the 12 groups, but there's quite a big variation in the social welfare dependencies. And it's particularly high among families of children with high-risk SEBD and with speech and language difficulties in SEBD. So again, perhaps these aren't too surprising, but I wanted to show you this slide, and then this one. This looks at basic levels of basic care, because when you look through the data and think about what is socioeconomic measuring, we think it's not sufficient to talk about, poorer children do worse, this kind of thing. We need to look at their environments as well. What is happening in the home? So this slide shows the home environment from a slightly different angle. These reports come from teachers, and they show I'll just explain how this was measured. It's based on teachers' responses in relation to the frequency with which the child arrives to school tired, inadequately dressed for the weather, without lunch, hungry, and showing a lack of cleanliness. Now, across all of the children that took part in growing up in Ireland, 3%, around 3% showed signs of a lack of basic care. And in 5 of the groups that we looked at, this is over 12%. So this shows us another angle. We think that this is a more useful indicator for policy than simply looking at social welfare or occupation. This is another measure that could be useful as well. It's the number of adverse life events experienced, and I think it's fair to say that children with special needs tend to have had a slightly more stressful or traumatic events happen to them. But again, you can see there's quite a lot of variation across the groups. Very high levels in children with general learning difficulties, autistic spectrum disorders, and speech and language difficulties with SEBD. I'm going to finish off very quickly because I'm mindful of the time. Another part of the report, this is chapter 5 in the report, looked at these outcomes in the broader context. So what we were trying to do was put the outcome together with the background characteristics. So what we did was we did multiple linear regression modelling to compare differences across children in the 12 groups to children without special needs on 9 outcomes. And so these are just a small selection of all of the outcomes that we looked at. And we looked at the differences of the children in the 12 groups on the outcomes before and after, accounting for differences in demographic, socioeconomic characteristics, school class and community factors. So I'll just give you an example of one here. So when we look at reading scores, the tables are kind of very data intensive, so I've just given you a summary here. The reading scores of children with a physical or sensory disability didn't differ from those of children without special needs in any of the models. So what we're taking from this is that children with these types of disabilities are doing just as well as children without special needs on reading, or on this measure of reading, regardless of home, school and community characteristics. A second finding that we got from this analysis, a more in-depth analysis of the reading scores, is that children with high-risk SEBD did just as well as children without special needs once we took account of their demographic and particularly socioeconomic and home background characteristics. So this may come as no big surprise, but it does suggest that supports that take children's broader context into account are appropriate for these children. And finally, the mean reading score of children with ASD was the same as children without special needs before taking into account various background characteristics. But once we took into account school characteristics, their scores were lower. So that's an interesting finding, and bearing in mind the number of children in this group is quite small, but it does say something about the optimal nature. What are the classroom environments of these children like? And I think we've heard a lot about that this morning. So this finding may be subject to, may not stand up to scrutiny, but it's worth noting. I'll hand you over now to Caroline. Thank you.
Thanks, Jude. I'll just bring you very quickly or very briefly over the qualitative chapter, which is chapter 6 in the report. So we looked at the 117 child-parent interviews and their associated field notes that were deposited in the Irish Qualitative Data Archive. So we'd like to thank them for the access and support in getting that data. In looking at the child interviews, there was 6 domains that we looked at, and parent interviews, so there was 5 domains addressed in the interviews. Now, obviously, we couldn't cover all of those domains as a focus in the reports. We actually, throughout the analysis, we focused on 3 overarching themes, each that had sub-themes. The 3 themes that we looked at were school and educational context, child wellbeing, and home environment. Today we're actually just going to focus on school and educational context and just give you a brief overview of some of the key points arising from that analysis. Looking at the children, there was 31 children and their families. This ranged from the first group, which was a confirmed special educational need, of which there was 9 children. In the second group, these were children with a possible SEN. Now, we had to do some analysis of the parent interviews to look at possible SEN because they weren't identified in the transcripts, or of any, because of the lack of triangulation with the quantitative data, we were unable to use any source of identification tool from that sort of analysis. So we ended up with two different categories of children. Group A were kind of children who had difficulties in school. They had literacy issues, spelling issues, or a very strong dislike of school or certain subjects. There was 13 children in that group. And then there was a second category within this possible group, children with emotional and behavioural difficulties. Some of these children were bullied or were strong worriers or may have experienced some adverse life events recently. There was one child that overlapped between groups A and B in that section. And there was 7 children in all that had the emotional behavioural difficulties. There was then 6 children who had a sibling with a special educational need, and we felt this was something that was worthwhile looking at to see for children who themselves may or may not have a special educational need, but being in a family with a sibling with a special educational need and the demands that puts on both the family and the parents and the child themselves. So within that group, there was 3 children that had themselves a special educational need and 3 that did not. So focusing on the school and educational context, the key findings we'd like to look at, and I'm going to go through some quotes from the parent and child interviews just to illustrate a few of these points. There was some dislike of school, tests or certain school subjects, and this does kind of match the quantitative findings. Particularly subjects like maths and Irish came up a lot, a strong dislike of tests, and it's where students had difficulties with subjects that they often articulated a strong dislike. And this is worrying for kind of an engagement issue for students at this age 9, which is something we'd like to follow up at age 13. However, students really valued the social aspects of school. They talked a lot about their friends and meeting people, and particularly for children in rural contexts, the social aspect of going to school and talking to people was something that children articulate a lot in their interviews. Having said that, these tests, they did mention tests a lot, and they mentioned the transition to secondary school and would some of their subjects get harder or more difficult, and this became a source of stress, which is covered in one of our other themes, child well-being. When looking at children's dislike of school, it would have been nice to look at their achievement scores, but unfortunately we didn't have that triangulation of data, so we can't tell you how well these students were doing outside of what their parents were saying and they said themselves. Parental awareness of child strengths and weaknesses was very clear throughout the interviews. The parents had a holistic perspective looking at their children. They looked at their academic and non-academic strengths and their weaknesses, but focused on the weaknesses that your child had. And also when they looked to the future and looked at their aspirations for their child, they were looking at what the child would be interested in doing themselves. They didn't articulate things like their CAO points or how well they would do in college or what kind of good jobs they would get or well-paid jobs. They were looking at the child being happy and looking at their overall well-being and how much they would be able to do in the future rather than focusing on the things that they wouldn't be able to do in the future. There was some evidence that the structured school system did not suit some of the children. In particular, I'll show you a quote from one of the parents who mentioned some of the strengths that her child had, that she felt the child had, that weren't particularly suited to the traditional learning environment. And there was some evidence that their non-academic strengths and interests were being overlooked within the education system. So just to quickly go through some of these extracts. You can read them for yourselves, but just to say that this particular child, she was from a medium SES background, she was from a rural background, and she fit into groups 2A and 2B. So she had both difficulties in school, or possible difficulties in school, and possible emotional behavioural difficulties. While she liked school, she didn't like the work, but she valued the social aspect of school. She did articulate that she didn't like maths and Irish. But having said that, she did articulate that in relation to tests and the dislike of tests. And looking at the parent interview, this is the one where we were looking at her son's talent for drawing, and she expressed frustration that this skill and talent was not being nurtured in the education system. This mother was from a high SES background, from an urban context, and her son was from Group 1, which he had a confirmed SEN. She was very proud of her child's strengths, but that they didn't seem to be nurtured in the system. So we're looking at this child and wondering, will he meet his full potential if she feels that he has these strengths in drawing, and clearly articulating that he would possibly go on to be an engineer or something like that. And finally, this parent is from a low SES background, a rural context, and is Group 1, so the child is from has a confirmed SEN. With here, the support that this child has received, this girl has received, they say that it's made a massive difference with her homework, and especially her reading, but particularly they articulated the impact on the child's confidence and how that supported the rest of her learning. The fact that she engages now. She used to be very hesitant in trying to attempt words, but she now goes for it, and her parents are very supportive of that. And also they're articulating that she likes school more now. They didn't say how she liked school previously, but they're saying she likes it more, which is always an improvement to see that her engagement has been turned around. So just to overall, that parents took a very holistic and very pragmatic overview of their children. They focused on their strengths and emphasised their overall well-being and into the future being happy and having a career that they're interested in. One thing that we haven't mentioned today but is in the report, and it seems to have come up in a lot of the previous presentations, is some concerns over delays in assessment and diagnosis and the support for children during the process. There was one parent who did articulate that the process of assessment was quite stressful, quite onerous for her child, and that there was some negative behaviour articulated an instance kind of in one of the interviews, and it's included in the report. But she was saying that, this process was difficult, but other parents said when they got the support that they required, that the students' improvement was marked and their confidence increased. And that's something that we'd like to point out across the qualitative interviews, that for the children who did receive support, most of the parents were very positive about the improvements that their children had. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. What I hope to do now is to link the recommendations in the report back to some of the key findings. So rather than read through the recommendations which are there, as I said, I'll look at the rationale as to why we've chosen these ones. So the first set of recommendations are around assessment and progress. And there was clear evidence in the report of teachers possibly underestimating the standards achieved by children with special educational needs relative to their peers. Almost twice as many children with special educational needs than children without were performing higher on the tests of reading and maths than their teachers' ratings would suggest. Now, there's lots of possible explanations there, but one of the issues that it does raise is in relation to assessment, and particularly in the context of the IEP. So there's a real necessity for assessment that's appropriate, tailored to needs, that's more criterion referenced, and aids teachers in assessing exactly where children are at and helps them to track their progress. The second set of recommendations are in relation to social, emotional and behavioural difficulties. Now again, clear evidence in the report for what we call a detrimental additive impact of SEBD when it co-occurs with other special educational needs on a range of outcomes. There's a lot of children here who are relatively anxious, unhappy, and these differences are not explained by their individual background characteristics. Secondly, children with SEBD, when it occurs on its own, are less likely to receive supports than those who have been diagnosed with another SEN. That SEBD is more prevalent among families with less favourable socioeconomic profiles and home environments, further underlines the need for identification tools and supports covering both internalising and externalising features. The third set of recommendations are around the clustering of children with special educational needs, in particular schools and classrooms. In the study, we found children with special educational needs that they tended to cluster in certain types of schools and classes. For example, the incidence of SEBD is considerably higher in DESH Band 1 schools than in non-DESH schools. Across the whole sample of children, 8.4% of children were in DEIS Band 1 schools, but 21% of children with high-risk SEBD were in DEIS Band 1 schools. The fourth set of recommendations are around the issue of engagement and parental expectations. In relation to parental expectations, with the exception of children with a physical or sensory disability, unfortunately, parents had very low expectations for their children's future educational careers. Almost 3 times as many parents of children with special educational needs compared to other parents expect them to have ended their formal education by the Leaving Cert. So that was a worrying finding. Secondly, in relation to engagement, and you saw the figures earlier, how overall 6% of children without special educational needs report they never like school, but it's 10% for children with special educational needs, with wide variations across the groups and between subjects. For example, in relation to reading, about 8% of children with special educational needs say they never like reading, but about 14% say they never like maths, which is a significant difference. Also in relation to disengagement, and it's in the report, but we didn't get to go into it in detail, are children's patterns of attendance, where for some groups of children that was a worry. Now, disengagement occurs over time and is very difficult to reverse, and it'll be one of the key issues to follow in the next wave. The next set of recommendations around the huge variation in strengths and needs. So results show wide variations in the outcomes of children with special educational needs, and they varied considerably along background characteristics, notably socioeconomic and home environments, the kind of schools and classes they were in. Each group had their own strengths and particular needs. And as stated, we can be very positive about the outcomes of children with physical and sensory disabilities. This group is generally doing as well as children without special educational needs. However, the variation between those with and without special educational needs and between themselves really underlines the need for individual education planning. And as you know, that aspect of the EPSN Act has not been made mandatory yet. In terms of the variations, just to give you an indication of some of the extent of that difference. In terms of social outcomes, parents were asked to report if their child had socialized with any child in the last week. And it ranged from 2.4% of children with general learning disabilities who hadn't socialized with any child, up to 28% of children on the autistic spectrum disorder. The next set of recommendations are in relation to bullying. Now, there are many, bullying occurs along a broad continuum. It's not entirely surprising that people's interpretations of what bullying is would differ, and this may account for at least some of the differences between the parent and children's reports of bullying. However, we know from a lot of unfortunate, sad experiences that we absolutely need to listen to children's voices. And in this report, incidences of being bullied reported by children were a lot different to what their parents were saying. Children with an SEBD, either occurring on its own or another SEN, were less likely to have parents showing an awareness of their being bullied, and were also more likely to report a negative impact. These findings underlined the need to enable teachers to identify and address bullying, and for schools to encourage an anti-bullying climate as part of an overall school and classroom behaviour management programme that tackles not just acting out, but withdrawing or acting in behaviours as well. Finally, we have recommendations in relation to the home and family environment. Several of the indicators indicated confirm the findings of existing research showing the association between social and economic disadvantage and special educational needs, particularly as it relates to SEBD. Worryingly, signs of a lack of basic care, which some might interpret as signs of neglect, were also much higher among some groups of children with special educational needs. These data suggest that there may be scope for developing a child-level risk index or measure that includes typical measures of socio-economic background, but also, as Jude outlined, home and family environment as well. So to sum up, because of the risks associated with developing special educational needs, the data clearly point to the need for prevention strategies, early intervention and identification that takes account of the child's total context. In other words, the community, the family, the school, the individual characteristics all need to be taken into account, and that's vital. Thank you very much.